All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Alexandros Pandazis, and I'm a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador and the president of the St. Anselm College Orthodox Christian Fellowship. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, I would like to welcome you all to the Institute today and to our college. Orthodox Christian Fellowship, also known as OCF, is the official campus ministry organization of the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops of the United States of America. OCF strives to guide Orthodox students along the path to Jesus Christ through his church, cultivating a campus community of worship, witness, service, fellowship, and education. The New Hampshire Institute of Politics mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life of their communities and to strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse political issues or candidates. Before we begin our program, I just want to say a few thank yous. First of all, thank you to Ann Kamen in the back, who helped OCF Campus Ministry and the Institute of Politics work together to put together this event, and to Kat, also in the back from Campus Ministry, who is super supportive with OCF, and without her, we wouldn't be as active as we are on campus. So thank you to both of you. Also, a few quick notes to remind you all of. In case of an emergency, there are 3 exits, one in the back of the room over there, another one in those main doors you came from, and then another in that door all the way in the corner. After the presentation and Dr. Papanicolaou's remarks, there will be a brief period for questions and answers. 2 students will be standing on either side of the room with microphones, so if you have questions, just get up and walk over to the microphone and ask away. Lastly, please turn off your cell phones or any other devices that might make some noise. Today's speaker, Dr. Aristotle Papanicolaou, is a professor of theology at Fordham University, where he earned his undergraduate degree in theology. He earned his Master's of Divinity at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology in Brookline, Massachusetts, and his PhD in theology from the University of Chicago. He is a senior fellow at the Emory University Center for the Study of Law and Religion, the Archbishop Dimitrios Chair in Orthodox Theology and Culture, and the co-founder and director of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham University. Throughout the year, the Orthodox Christian Studies Center puts out a variety of publications, including Public Orthodoxy, the Journal of Orthodox Christian Studies, the Orthodox Christianity and Contemporary Thought book series, and the Christian Arabic Texts in Translation book series. Dr. Papanicolaou has also written and edited several books of his own, including the book The Mystical as Political, and he is a co-editor of the award-winning Christianity, Democracy, and the Shadow of Constantine. So without further ado, Dr. Papanicolaou.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Even though I know my picture won't go up on the wall, I'm still very happy to. It's really it's really quite intimidating just to kind of look around and see how many very important people and the role that the Institute has played in terms of contemporary politics. But I'm happy to speak with you a little bit about maybe something that doesn't seem quite relevant to American politics, but is actually is and has some geopolitical significance. It highlights a little bit the role of religion, I think, in public life and politics in ways that might be a little bit surprising. And after, it's a little bit, we just had a seminar on human rights and orthodoxy at Fordham University that our center sponsored, and we had some journalists there. And after discussing a little bit in a group some of the issues that I'm going to raise with you, one of the journalists said, "Oh, we didn't realize that there was a second collusion going on." Anyway, all that will be, in fact, a couple of the journalists actually written a couple of pieces, and maybe I can give the names to Alexandros, and he can maybe disseminate to some of you who are here. And I think that will become a little bit clearer to you after I sort of outline some things in the talk I'm about to give. Okay? So this will be, according to the instructions, this will be about 40 minutes, and then we'll have, I think, plenty of time for chatting. All right. Although my talk today centers on church and politics in Russia, I feel the need to provide a little background on the relation between church and politics in the Orthodox Church throughout its history, which I think is necessary for understanding the situation in Russia today. Russian Orthodoxy itself identifies with the kind of Orthodox Christianity that has ties to the Byzantine Empire. And just to clarify, there are other forms of Christianity that identify as Orthodox, but would not see the relationship to the Byzantine Empire in positive terms, such as the Armenian and Coptic forms of Christianity. As is well known, the so-called Byzantine Empire refers actually to the Roman Empire that was slowly but surely Christianized after the conversion of the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. There emerged within this Christian Roman Empire an unprecedented relationship between what became the consolidated institutional church and the Roman imperial state. This relationship has often been described by the word sinfonia, which means kind of harmony. And it is meant to convey a separation of powers that cooperates for the good of the Christian Roman Empire. Many people think that within the Christian Roman Empire there existed what is called Caesaropapism, where the emperor takes on the mantle of both secular and religious ruler, but this would be false. The relationship between the church and the imperial government in the 1100-year history of this Christianized Roman Empire is complicated, but it is clear that the church, together with its bishops and monks, had a very strong sense of their own independence and authority. That notwithstanding, it was a Christianized Roman Empire, and the church expected certain things from the imperial government, while the latter expected certain things from the church. But both recognized the legitimate authority of the other as they attempted something like a sinfonia. What was left of the Christian Roman Empire fell in 1453 to the Ottomans, and most of the Orthodox world, in the broadest sense of the term, was under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. The exception was Russia. Christianity in Russia emerged via the Christian Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, and as a result, after the fall, the Russians, in some sense, eventually saw themselves as the inheritors of this Christian Roman Empire. There even developed a tradition of speaking about Moscow as the third Rome, but there's a debate about the pervasiveness and influence of this tradition. Although the Russians adopted the Sinfonia model, it is fair to say that after Tsar Peter I's reforms in the 18th century, there did emerge a kind of Caesaropapism. I say a kind of Caesaropapism because it was not so much that the Tsar assumed the mantle of both supreme secular and religious leader, but the church did become officially an administrative branch of the Tsarist state and subject to the surveillance and control of the state. As but one example, the Bishop of Moscow was no longer a patriarch, the traditional title, but was in essence demoted to Metropolitan of Moscow. The supreme authority resided with a Holy Synod of bishops and lay people, and which was overseen by a non-clerical official of the state known as the chief procurator. If you read Dostoevsky's novels, you see that popping up quite often. All of this, of course, collapsed with the communist takeover of Russia, where Orthodox Christians were mostly subjected to brutal oppression, even if at times the communist state felt the need to use the church for various purposes. At the point of the communist takeover of Russia, there is a period of great transition in the Orthodox world, constituted primarily by Russia, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Greece, and Middle Eastern and North African churches. The Ottoman Empire crumbled, Greece became independent in the 1820s, but didn't fully kick out the Ottomans from what is now modern-day Greece until the 1920s. At the same time, however, communism would eventually take over most of the Orthodox world after World War II. The next major event in the Orthodox world would, of course, be the fall of communism in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. So I'm taking the time to set up this history because what it reveals is that the Orthodox world, for most of its history, had to negotiate church politics relationships in the context of imperial or totalitarian structures. Put another way, it was only after the fall of communism that the Orthodox churches, for the first time, really had to confront the political option of liberal democracy. Greece did have a constitutional monarchy after World War II, but it was a constitutional monarchy in which the Greek king did insert himself in politics. The Greek king was exiled in late 1960s, and it really only then, after the fall of communism, that the Orthodox churches in these traditional Orthodox countries are confronted with the reality of living without an emperor, especially if one considers the communist dictators as a type of imperial figure. what would emerge is a very ambivalent attitude toward liberal democracy. And that ambivalent attitude takes on a different form in different parts of the Orthodox world. What is really very interesting is that there's not a single Orthodox church in the world today that would reject democratic liberalism. This situation is very much unlike the Roman Catholic situation of the past century, where the debate was really about whether, in fact, the Roman Catholic Church could embrace democratic liberalism, and in particular, the reality of church-state separation. It is also what differentiates Orthodoxy from the debate within Islam, where the question really is about the compatibility of Islamic beliefs and democratic liberalism. Now, there may be non-Orthodox who raise this question, as Samuel Huntington did, among others, with his famous Clash of Civilizations thesis. But among the Orthodox themselves, the debate seems to be not about the compatibility between democratic liberalism and orthodoxy, but about the role of religion within a democratic polity that affirms liberal values, such as freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and even in some cases, church-state separation, which exists, for example, technically in Russia, but not in Greece. The debate within Orthodoxy is over the implication of its core theological principles for the shape of democracy, specifically the role in which Orthodox thought should have in shaping the moral horizon of the public political space. Such a question is being posed in the Orthodox world with a focus specifically on the role of the Church in what I would call the public political space. And this debate takes place specifically in relation to the Church's response to very specific issues, such as the legalization of abortion, of surrogacy, or of gay marriage, or of gay civil unions. It is also taking place in relation to questions of the relation of Orthodoxy to national, cultural, and ethnic identity. This question of the role of the Church in the public political space is taking place regardless of the formal church-state relations within a given Orthodox country. To understand fully the Orthodox debate about the role of religion in public life, we must also be aware of how this debate intersects with another trajectory within post-communist Orthodox countries in particular, and this is the effort to reestablish the cultural, ethnic, nationalistic, and to some extent political influence of Orthodoxy in these Eastern European countries. After the fall of communism, it was not very clear what would happen to religion in the traditional Orthodox countries. It did not take long, however, to quickly discern that the institutional Orthodox churches experienced a new independence, though it would take time to determine whether the historic role of Orthodox Christianity within these countries would be integrated as part of the national and cultural identity, or whether communist, secularist as atheist ideology would have a long-lasting effect on the self-understanding of future generations as Russian, Serbian, Romanian, Georgian, etc. One thing is clear. The institutional Orthodox churches were determined to reconnect the link between national and religious identity through multiple, mostly non-coordinated strategies. In Russia, this reconnection of religious and national identity seems to have been accomplished as a Pew Research Center analysis of data from the International Social Survey Program indicates that in 2008, 72% of Russian adults identify as Orthodox Christians, up from 32% in 1991, while only 7% attend religious services once a month. Similar patterns exist in Belarus, Romania, Serbia, and Bulgaria. In fact, these 5 countries, together with China, have recorded the largest increase in religious affiliation. In Russia in particular, after the fall of communism, the church politics situation was very much in flux. There seems to be little doubt that in the early part of the 1990s, there was a revival of the church, an experience of freedom, and an opening toward liberalism in the form of freedom of expression, conscience, practice, etc. In the church itself, Sergei Shapnin, the former editor of the Journal of the Moscow Patriarchate, who was actually fired from his position in 2015, speaks about the 1990s as Church Revival 1.0, where the emphasis was on catechism and pastoral approaches to rebuilding the parish life. However, during this period, Christian missionaries would flood into Russia, and this influx of Protestant missionaries would influence the Russian Orthodox Church's attitude towards its own role within Russian society, as well as deepen an already present suspicion of the West. As but one example, between 1992 and 97, missionaries from Campus Crusade worked to develop a Christian ethics curriculum to be taught in the schools of Russia, which the Russian Orthodox Church approved, but it was a pretext to missionize Russian children toward Protestant evangelical Christianity. As a result of this influx of missionary activity from primarily the Christian Protestant West, the Church put its weight behind the 1997 Russian law on freedom of conscience and religious association. The law divided various religions into categories of religious organizations, which consists of Russian Orthodoxy, Judaism, Islam, and Buddhism, and then another category of groups, which consists of Roman Catholics, Mormons, Baptists, Lutherans, Pentecostals, Presbyterians, and apportioned rights and privileges in accordance with a particular category. Its goal was primarily to make it very difficult to legally exist and conduct activities within Russia. The Russian Orthodox Church, of course, supported it, and in hindsight, it was the first real victory in its efforts to slowly reestablish itself as a cultural and political force within Russia. At the time, however, it did not necessarily signal that the Church was highly influential within Russian politics. According to Irina Popkova in her book, The Orthodox Church in Russian Politics, there has been little discernible evidence that the Russian Orthodox Church had any measurable influence on legislative initiatives passed in the Duma. And in fact, Popkova has a point. Even though the law on freedom of conscience and religious association had the backing of the Church, it certainly was not the case that it was passed because of this reason. Furthermore, in August 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church constructed a comprehensive social document entitled The Orthodox Church and Society, the basis of the social concept of the Russian Orthodox Church, in which it attempts to formulate not simply its own sense of how the Church is to function in relation to Russian society, broadly speaking, but outlines the Church's position on various social issues. Popkova is right to indicate that this document in and of itself had little impact, and there's a study that shows that most Russians never even heard about it. So on the surface, it appears that the Russian Orthodox Church, in spite of its many efforts, has really had a negligible impact on the Russian political sphere. However, both in relation to the religious association law and the social concept, it is clear that the Russian Orthodox Church was attempting to reposition itself as a major player within Russian society, both culturally and politically. In both situations, it appeals to the cultural and historical importance of orthodoxy to Russian identity itself. In the case of the religious association law, its goal was to protect its privileged position in relation to Russian society. In the case of the social concept, it outlined to some extent a plan for extending its influence within Russian society. It may be the case that prior to 2012, the Russian Orthodox Church's direct influence on the Russian political sphere should not be overstated. However, the vision the ROC imagined for itself through the 1997 law on religious association and the social concept started to bear fruit after 2012, a full year after the publication of Popkova's book. The document that becomes important for noticing this shift in the Russian Orthodox Church's influence is the Russian Orthodox Church's basic teaching on human dignity, freedom, and rights, which I will refer to as the DFR, approved in 2008. That the Russian Orthodox Church should devote an entire document to human rights might seem a bit strange, but as we will see, it becomes part of what has been a larger strategy to position Russia over and against the West, meaning Europe and the United States. The DFR, approved by the Bishops' Council of the Moscow Patriarchate in 2008, was the culmination and crystallization of rhetoric that was discernible in Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union, but especially at the start of the new millennium. This document can be interpreted as a correction to the Declaration on Human Rights and Dignity by the 10th World Council of Russian People, a separate body, which is not an official organization of the Russian Orthodox Church, even if the president is the Patriarch of Moscow, and its seat is at the Danilov Monastery on the premises of the Moscow Patriarchate. In the 2006 Human Rights Declaration, the World Russian People's Council offered an interpretation of human rights based on the link between human dignity and human rights to the concept of morality. Let me explain. In other words, although one's worth was a given, one's dignity is not a given, but a quality acquired by enacting moral principles. The World Russian People's Council was attempting to express an understanding of human rights counter to that of Western liberalism. Human rights are not inherent based on the inherent equal worth of all human beings, and thus cannot be used as a basis for the freedom to commit immoral acts. Predictably, and corresponding to the anti-Western positioning of this document, such immoral acts include especially the freedom of sexual expression, which entails but is not limited to gay marriage. In the 2008 DFR, now the official one by the Russian Orthodox Church, there is no mention of human worth, but the ROC did manage to maintain the link between dignity and morality. Rather than distinguishing between an inherent worth and a dignity that is earned, the ROC distinguishes between a God-given ontological dignity that is inherent to human nature even after the fall, and a dignified life. It is in relation to the notion of a dignified life that the ROC retains the link between morality and dignity that was evident in the 2006 declaration. What the ROC is attempting to convey is that by virtue of creation, all human beings are given by God an inherent dignity, but as a result of the fall and of sin, this dignity has become distorted, darkened to the point of indiscernibility, resulting in human indignity, as well as in the derogation and humiliation of one's own dignity and that of others. And there I was using expressions from the translation of this document. Up to this point, one would not find much that is controversial in the ROC statement about dignity. It recognizes an irreducible worth to all human beings, which sin obfuscates. The challenge is somehow to confront sin so as to embody, make manifest, and reveal a dignity that already exists. Such an interpretation of dignity is a fairly standard adaptation of the image and likeness distinction to a concept, dignity, that actually has no history in the Orthodox tradition until fairly recently. What is original in the DFR is that the ROC offers an interpretation on human rights based on this distinction between inherent dignity and a dignified life. The ROC argues that because dignity is distorted as a result of sin, that obedience to moral principles is the way to restore the dignity inherent to all humans. So this is a quote from the DFR. According to the Orthodox tradition, a human being preserves his God-given dignity and grows in it only if he lives in accordance with moral norms. Between these norms express the primordial and therefore authentic human nature not darkened by sin. Thus, there is a direct link between human dignity and morality. Moreover, the acknowledgement of personal dignity implies the assertion of personal responsibility. The development and implementation of the human rights concept should be harmonized with the norms of morality, with the ethical principle laid down by God in human nature and discernible in the voice of conscience. The voice of conscience, you should notice an appeal to natural law, which is not very common in the Orthodox tradition. So the need for morality for a dignified life means that humans cannot have the right to freely exercise their will in whatever way they choose. The basic point is that whatever is defined as a right cannot sanction immorality. What is unique about the ROC's logic is not so much the use of an anthropological distinction between image and likeness so as to justify a particular regime of governance, but that such a distinction is now translated into the modern language of dignity and human rights. By making such a move, the ROC is attempting to simultaneously affirm and deny Huntington's thesis of a so-called clash of civilizations, by demonstrating that it is not so much against modern liberal notions of human rights and dignity, but against the dominant Western liberal understandings of these concepts. Rights, according to the ROC, should be defined so as not to contradict the human being's duty or responsibility to live a dignified life, or at the very least so as not to encourage human indignity caused by sin. It comes as no surprise, then, that the ROC would seek to deny rights that have, quote, legislative and public support given to various vices, such as sexual lechery and perversions, but also to the worship of profit and violence, abortion, euthanasia, use of human embryos in medicine, experiments changing a person's nature, and the like, end quote. A little more unusual is the ROC's claim that, quote, human rights should not contradict love for one's homeland and neighbors, which the ROC justifies by claiming that the, quote, Orthodox tradition traces patriotism back to the words of Christ the Savior himself. Greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends, end quote. At another occasion where I was speaking about this, someone reminded me that this quote was actually used during the Nazi period, the German Nazi sort of period in the 30s and the 40s. So the ROC amplifies by stating that, quote, one's human rights cannot be set against the values and interests of one's homeland, community, and family. The exercise of human rights should not be used to justify any encroachment on religious holy symbols, things, that's a translation, cultural values, and the identity of a nation, end quote. Such rights are excluded because for the ROC, quote, in orthodoxy, there is an immutable conviction that in ordering its life, a society should take into account not only human interests and wishes, but also the divine truth, the eternal moral law given by the Lord and working in the Lord no matter whether the will of particular people or people's communities agree with it or not, end quote. So the ROC is ironically appropriating the modern concepts of human rights and dignity for promoting a political configuration against which human rights and dignity language was meant to protect. It does so by positioning its interpretation of human rights and dignity against, quote, secularized standards of human rights. Although the freedom of conscience is designated as a right, it is relegated to the private sphere as the ROC promotes a public political space infused with the moral principles of Orthodox Christianity, as interpreted by the Russian Orthodox Church, and enforced legislatively by the state. The language of rights and dignity is still used, but within this specific religiously inflected moral horizon. What has formed the basis for a plurality of moralities in the West is being used to define a morally homogeneous space as an identity marker against the West. And according to the ROC, laws against so-called gay propaganda and arrests for blasphemous expressions, such as the Pussy Riot incident, do not violate rights, and thus dignity, since they violate the morality that facilitates a so-called dignified life. Although the ROC is not rejecting human rights discourse, it clearly positions its own interpretation against what it sees as a godless, extreme secularist, individualistic, hedonistic, humanist, anti-religious interpretation of the West. You often see these adjectives in Russian discourse. There is clearly an anti-Westernism that pervades the discourse of the ROC, and it cannot be attributed simply to the continuation of Cold War rhetoric. Anti-Western discourse is pervasive throughout contemporary Orthodox theology in a way that was not evident in the Byzantine period. The ROC rhetoric against the godless, secularist, humanist, hedonistic understanding of human rights discourse in the West cannot be rendered intelligible as simply being co-opted into the broader geopolitical struggle between Russia and Western Europe, the United States. The ROC's anti-Westernism is part of a broader Orthodox self-identification against the Catholic Protestant West. In the end, if the West is currently godless, individualistic, atheistic, and hedonistic, then that should be attributed to the inevitable theological mistakes of the Catholics and the Protestants. Again, this is how they think, not how I think. Long before such a view of modern Western history was popularized within the academy by theologians like John Milbank or the Greek theologians like John Romanidis and Christos Yanida, they were advancing such an understanding of the modern West as early as the 1970s. What we see emerging, however, in the ROC document is the construction of a new West, which is the West of atheistic secular liberalism. And it is the construction of this new West that, as we shall see, gets the attention of Vladimir Putin. It is very tempting to brush off the ROC's analysis of human rights as laughable, and it would be if it did not constitute the preamble of a fusion of minds between the ROC and Putin, especially the Putin of the third presidential term after 2012. The first sign of this fusion starts to occur when there was a serious attempt by the Russian government to undermine the universality of human rights language. Long before the Russian government took aim at the universality of human rights language, Patriarch Kirill was already attacking Western liberalism. For example, in 1999, at the Joint Russian-Iranian Commission on Islam-Orthodox Dialogue, held in Moscow, Kirill, who was then Metropolitan of Smolensk and Kaliningrad, and the chairman of the Department of External Relations for the Moscow Patriarchate, expressed his unified stance with the president of Iran's Culture and Islamic Relations Organization in protecting traditions against what they perceived as an attack from Western liberal values. Christina Stockel explains that in 2005, the Church's standpoint on human rights shifted from mere rejection to a strategy of acceptance through rejection. This strategy is evident in the analysis that I have just given on the 2008 DFR document. But in 2005, we also see that the Church's strategy was not simply for internal consumption, but was targeted to a wider audience. It was in 2005 that Kirill, still Metropolitan and not yet Patriarch, cited for the first time Article 29 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 29 states, in part, 1, quote, everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of his personality is possible. 2, in the exercise of his rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law solely for the purpose of securing due recognition and respect for the rights and freedoms of others, and of meeting the just requirements of morality, public order, and the general welfare in democratic society, end quote. For a very good analysis of this particular document, I recommend a fairly recent book by Sam Moyne from Yale University called Christian Human Rights. And I also recommend his most recent book called Not Enough, which is also on human rights. So according to Stockel, and Christina Stockel is principal investigator of a European Research Council grant, a project called Post-Secular Conflicts, which I encourage you to look up on the web. It has a lot of information, a lot more amplification of some of the things that I'm speaking to you about today. So according to Stockel, the discovery, quote, the discovery of Article 29 had an important effect on the human rights debate in the Russian Orthodox Church because it provided the means through which the Church no longer had to place itself in opposition to a Western individualistic understanding of human rights, but instead might actively present itself as the vanguard of a more original understanding of human rights according to Article 29, an understanding that emphasizes the importance of morality and duties to the community, end quote. This approach would be evident in a speech Kirill gave in Strasbourg in 2006, to UNESCO in 2007, and that Patriarch Alexei gave to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in 2007, and which is clearly evident in the 2008 DFR document. It is in this approach to human rights that one starts to discern a fusion of minds between the ROC and the Russian government that would ultimately develop into a geopolitical strategy, and what could even say the construction of a new ideological divide, a kind of cultural Cold War between East and West. In fact, according to Marcel van Herpen, on September 28, 2007, the coordinated strategy between the ROC and the Russian government is discernible in a speech that the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov gave before the 62nd session of the UN General Assembly, quote, in which he proposed the setting up of a consultative council of religions in the UN, end quote. A few weeks after, Patriarch Alexei spoke before the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and, quote, told the parliamentarians that today there occurs a break between human rights and morality, and this break threatens European civilization, end quote. According to Van Herpen, quote, the next move in this Russian offensive against human rights came on October 2nd, 2009, when the Russian Federation submitted a resolution to the UN Human Rights Council titled Promoting Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms Through a Better Understanding of Traditional Values of Humankind, end quote. The resolution asked that a workshop be organized, which did eventually take place in October 2010 in Geneva, under the title Traditional Values and Human Rights. Among the participants in this workshop was Igumen Philip, representative of the Moscow Patriarchate in Strasbourg. In his speech at the workshop, Philip had this to say, quote, "It is about time that the ideological monopoly in the sphere of human rights is over. From the point of view of democracy, it is important to provide an opportunity for representatives from different philosophical and moral views to participate in the development of the institution of human rights," end quote. And according to Stockel, quote, "The representative of the Moscow Patriarchate made a call for the inclusion of religious voices into a post-secular type of deliberation over human rights," end quote. After other resolutions and studies, the effort ultimately failed to go any further in the UN Human Rights Council. But the effort is significant because it indicates that Kirill's discovery of Article 29 was not used simply to craft an understanding of the contextuality of human rights for internal Russian consumption, but it became part of a coordinated effort by the ROC and the Russian government to challenge the universality of human rights language, appealing to the traditional values of European civilization, and quite ironically, the right of particular cultures to interpret human rights according to their own traditions. This joint venture between the ROC and the Russian government to influence the geopolitical scene was only just the beginning. The joint venture would pick up steam after 2012 and would ultimately emerge as an ideological tool by which would be carved out a new divide between East and West. The new ideological divide was not about capitalism versus communism, nor was it about democracy versus totalitarianism. It was about a democracy based on traditional values versus a democracy based on liberal, godless, individualistic values. After 2012, the Russians, both the ROC and the Russian government, have partnered to globalize the culture wars and have been working to form alliances with the religious right and the more extreme alt-right in efforts to consolidate an international right and a global right centered primarily around the promotion of traditional values. Anyone who doubts that Putin is using Russia's Orthodox history and theology as a way of carving out a Russian identity against Western liberalism will hopefully be convinced by the picture of Putin at Mount Athos in the Church of the Prototon, and that's the picture I have. Oh, it went down, didn't it? Did we get it back up here? So maybe Alexandros can get it back up. I'm sure you saw it. So this picture of Putin at Mount Athos is a monastic center in Greece. If you go to northern Greece by Thessaloniki, you'll see that it has three peninsulas or three fingers, and one of them is devoted entirely to monasteries. Unfortunately, women cannot step on this piece of land. And Putin went to the head monastery there, and he sat on a throne, which is normally saved for important religious leaders. What is significant is that in the Russian press, they were sort of narrating or weaving a story that that throne used to be saved or used to be used by Byzantine emperors, but that's false. But what's important is the fact that it was kind of being portrayed in that particular kind of way, again, which is very, very symbolic for thinking about this particular kind of fusion between Russian Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodox Church, and the Russian government. So here, Putin is projecting himself as not against democracy, or in general, let's say, but he, along with other religious and non-religious actors, is just globalizing the American culture wars for the sake of demarcating a stable Russian identity based on the fusion of nationalism and religion. So why the shift in 2012? Russian analysts attribute this development to the protests that occurred after the 2000 elections in Russia. It was after these protests that Putin, in his third presidential term, would start to appeal to populist, nationalistic, patriotic, and conservative religious sentiments. This term would coincide with that of the Russian Orthodox Church, which around 2002 shifted from a church revival focused on revitalizing parishes to a church revival 2.0, according to Chapnin, that would focus on reasserting the cultural and political power of the church in Russian society. The United Nations and Human Rights episode was an example of a coordinated effort through procedural channels, and now the effort is much more ideological and thus much more rhetorical in scope, but one that could impact the political scene, especially in terms of strengthening more extreme forms of right-wing politics. The formula is really very simple. Putin more explicitly started to draw on Orthodox history to define what it means to be Russian. To be Russian meant to embrace this history, which means also to embrace the fact that traditional values has always been a part of the cultural fabric of Russian society. Putin started to define patriotism and nationalism around the fusion of Russian identity and traditional values, which means that the usual enemies of Russia, the US and Europe, were enemies not because of capitalism, but because they promote values that threaten Russian society. Some have argued that Putin is resurrecting Tsar Nicholas I's slogan of orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. He sent a clear veiled signal in the 2013 State of the Nation speech when he said, quote, "In many countries today, moral and ethical norms are being reconsidered. National traditions, differences in nation and culture are being erased. They're now requiring not only the proper acknowledgement of freedom of conscience, political views, and private life, but also the mandatory acknowledgement of the equality of good and evil, which are inherently contradictory concepts," end quote. In theological language, what we have is a political apophaticism, defining Russian over and against what it is not, which is, of course, the West in all its decadence. This defining of Russian identity, nationalism, and patriotism in terms of traditional values can be seen in the types of legislation that have been passed since 2012. The most notorious in my mind is the 2013 anti-gay propaganda law, which purportedly protects children from information advocating for a denial of traditional family values. Also in 2013, the Dima Yakovlev law bans U.S. citizens from adoption of Russian children, and many think that this law was passed to prevent gay couples in U.S. from adopting Russian children. Also in 2013, a law was passed criminalizing insult to religious believers, which is hardly surprising given the Pussy Riot incident of 2012, and which corresponds with the ROC's rhetoric that rights do not entail blaspheming. The latest in the series of traditional values laws that were passed is fairly recent and was just signed into law by Putin. It is dubbed the slapping law, and it decriminalizes first offenders of domestic abuse that does not result in serious injury. Although all of the laws had the support of the ROC, in the slapping law, the ROC had a direct influence on the final shape of this law. Initially, the law was meant to decriminalize battery, but domestic abuse was exempted. The ROC fought to eliminate this exemption. According to Lena Zazulin, the opposition was led by the Moscow Patriarchate's Commission on the Question of the Family, Protection of Motherhood and Children, which critique the, quote, uncritical, thoughtless copying and use by certain clergy and laity of the concepts, terms, and understandings that are far from neutral and have anti-family and anti-Christian ideological roots and directions, such as family violence or domestic violence, gender, etc., end of quote. So the promotion of so-called traditional values against Western liberalism goes beyond freedom of expression, blasphemy, for example, or basic rights protecting sexual minorities. It even extends to domestic violence. Basically, if the West says it's wrong, it has something to do with the family, religion, or sex, we say it's right. I have not mentioned abortion, and Russia has one of the highest rates in the world, but there are signs that laws restricting abortion are next on the traditional values legislative agenda, building on a law that was passed in 2011. There are many other examples beyond the legislative I can give that indicate how Russian Orthodoxy and the ROC have become important for the global projection of Russianness and the attempt to expand Russian influence. The building of Russian churches around the world funded by the government, the meeting of Pope Francis and Patriarch Kirill in Cuba, the use by Putin of the term Ruski Mir or Russian world to signal a kind of unified Russian culture beyond Russian borders, and was used in part to justify Russian incursions into Crimea and eastern Ukraine. But I will end with the focus still being on traditional values agenda and introduce one last player, American evangelicals. Now, one would think that American evangelicals would want to have nothing to do with the Russian Orthodox Church, especially after the 1997 Russian law on religious association. This law was reaffirmed and strengthened by the 2016 Yarovaya laws, which was billed as an anti-terrorism package, but restricts the activities of Protestant Christians in Russia. In spite of these restrictions, there is strong evidence that American evangelicals see the Russian state, together with the Russian Orthodox Church, as a vehicle for advancing a global traditional values agenda. And Russians see an alliance with evangelicals as useful for strengthening an international political right that could disrupt the status quo in Europe and the US, and also project Russian influence globally. On the American evangelical side, there are clear signs of love for Russia, beginning with Patrick Buchanan, who wrote a 2014 article indicating that God is now on Putin's side. Specifically, Buchanan said that, quote, "In the culture war for the future of mankind, Putin is planting Russia's flag firmly on the side of traditional Christianity." Franklin Graham has not been shy about his own praise for Putin, lauding him for protecting traditional Christianity while chastising Obama for permitting atheism. Patriarch Kirill returned the favor and called Graham a confessor of the faith. Somewhat related, on a recent visit to Romania by Brad Parsale, Donald Trump's 2020 campaign advisor, Patriarch Daniel of Romania expressed his appreciation for President Trump, noting that he is a defender and promoter of traditional values and moral values, in particular of Christian values. The anti-LGBTQ activist Paul Cameron spoke to the Russian State Duma in October 2013, quote, "to thank the Russian people, the State Duma, and President Putin in the name of the entire Christian world," end quote. The World Congress of Families managing director, Larry Jacobs, praised Russians as the Christian saviors of the world, adding, quote, "I think Russia is the hope for the world right now," end quote. The World Congress of Family also listed Russia's emergence as a pro-family leader as one of the 10 best trends of 2013. According to Christopher Stroop, it is little known that the World Congress of Families was the brainchild of Anatoly Antonov and Viktor Medkov, a pair of sociology professors at Lomonosov Moscow State University, and Alan Carlson, WCF's current president emeritus in 2005. The WCF was to have its conference in September 2014 in Moscow, but the Russian invasion into Crimea and the placing of Russian WCF financial supporters on US sanctions, it kind of spooked WCF officials. An unofficial conference took place in October 2014 with the backing of the WCF, but in Utah in 2015 at the WCF conference, the Russian Patriarchate representatives were present, including Alexei Komov, WCF's regional representative for Russia and the Commonwealth of Independent States, and a member of the Russian Orthodox Church's Patriarchal Commission of the Family and the Protection of Motherhood and Childhood. According to Stroop, he argued that since Russians and Eastern Europeans had already survived an era of anti-religious persecution, they were now prepared to help our brothers in the West in their struggle against the new totalitarianism of political correctness and sexual revolution. Stroop adds that, quote, "Russia is taking on the mantle of leadership of global social conservatism. That conference gave Russia the chance to say, 'We're the leaders here,' and people have responded to that and followed along," end quote. These links then between American evangelicals and Russian ROC representatives, Russian oligarchs, and even representatives of the Russian government are not insignificant. They are further evidence of Russia's broader strategy to emerge as the champion of traditional values, to strengthen the various forms of right-wing political parties and movements, and to extend its influence not so much through hard power, but through soft power mechanisms. So I think I've painted a broad enough picture, but I want to end now with just a few summary points which we could flesh out in the discussion. First, when talking about church and politics in Russia, we see a situation where at one time the Russian church had to advocate for its particular social views. It's almost becoming a given that its social agenda will become part of the legal landscape of Russia, especially if Putin's current ideological vision is one of Russia as the global champion of traditional values. Second, as this global champion of traditional values, it's no surprise then that part of Russia's geopolitical strategy is to promote extreme right-wing groups, anywhere from American white nationalists to France's National Front Party, especially since strengthening of these right-wing parties could disrupt the status quo in the US and Europe. And whereas at one time Russia was afraid of the importation of American evangelicalism into Russia, it is now the case that Russia is actually, in the words of Chris Stroop, exporting the traditional values agenda. In this sense, it makes it even more plausible for Russia to have intervened in elections in some way to promote Donald Trump, not because of some friendship between Putin and Trump, but because part of Trump's base includes American evangelicals and white nationalists who share with Putin and the ROC an agenda against Western liberalism. It is really important to note here that the target is not US or Europe in itself, but what is perceived as dominant liberal ideology. That is why American evangelicals have no problem forming alliances with Russians. Third, under John Kerry, the State Department launched a Religion and Global Affairs Department. Given American evangelical and white nationalist support of Trump, it would not be imprudent to keep an eye on activities of that office under this new administration. And finally, all that's happening in Russia and its global political implications should indicate the need for taking religion seriously when it comes to international affairs. But religion should not be taken seriously simply for the sake of understanding what's going on. Insofar as there is a particular theology undergirding the Russian Orthodox Church's own vision for its role in Russian society, and insofar as the Russian government for the moment is drawing on that vision for its own vision of Russianness and Russia's role in the world, then to simply argue that religion should have nothing to do with politics, as some liberals are likely to do, is an inadequate response. Needed are theological responses. If the ROC is carving out a vision based on bad theology, then what's needed is a response on their own terms. Bad theology is only countered by good theology. Saying that theology doesn't count in certain settings only fuels the very ideological agenda taking shape in Russia. Thank you.